The biting chill of a New York winter settled into every corner of the city, its grip relentless and unforgiving. Frost etched intricate patterns on subway station windows, the cold air swirling in fierce gusts through the streets like a feral animal let loose. The bustling chaos of Manhattan carried on despite the weather's assault. Commuters, bundled in scarves and puffer coats, hunched against the wind as they navigated crowded sidewalks. Yet even in the noise and bustle, there was a stillness to this kind of cold a moment when the city seemed muted, every sound muffled by the weight of the frigid air. Baron Trump, a man of wealth and quiet contemplation, paused at the top of the subway steps. His tailored overcoat, though designed for warmth and elegance, did little to shield him from the bite of the wind. He pulled his scarf tighter around his neck and adjusted the fur-lined gloves on his hands. Standing there, he observed the scene below with the same measured curiosity he applied to everything in his life. His eyes, a sharp and calculating blue, swept over the subway entrance, where a steady stream of commuters descended into the underground labyrinth. A faint grimace flickered across his face as the faint odor of the subway, the pungent mix of dampness, steel, and human life wafted up to meet him. It was then that he noticed the man on the steps. At first, Baron's gaze passed over him, as it might any other feature of the urban landscape. But something about the figure drew his attention back, holding it like a whisper meant only for him. The man was slumped against the icy concrete railing, his shoulders hunched beneath a tattered coat far too thin for the season. A knit hat, riddled with holes, clung to his head, doing little to conceal the matted graying hair beneath. His skin was pale and weathered, the kind of pallor born not just of cold, but of hunger and exhaustion. He sat motionless, as if frozen in place, his hands stuffed deep into his coat pockets. His breath came in shallow puffs of vapor, dissipating quickly in the bitter air. Baron Trump watched for a moment, noting the way the man's gaze remained fixed downward, as if staring at some distant point on the salt-streaked stairs. There was a fragility to him, a sense that he might crumble to dust if touched. The city's rhythm continued around him, its inhabitants flowing past without so much as a second glance. To them, he was invisible, an unremarkable shadow in a city teeming with them. Baron shifted his weight, one gloved hand resting on the metal railing of the subway entrance. His mind, always quick to categorize and analyze, began turning over the sight before him. What stories lived in the hollowed-out eyes of this man? What choices or what circumstances beyond his control had brought him to this cold patch of stone? Baron had always prided himself on his ability to read people, to discern the truths they carried whether they spoke them or not. And yet, the man on the steps was an enigma, his silence more telling than any words could have been. It occurred to Baron that the man's position, perched on the cusp between the chaotic streets above and the shadowed depth of the subway below, was almost symbolic. He seemed caught in limbo, suspended between worlds, neither fully a part of the city's vibrant life, nor entirely consumed by its darker underbelly. Baron couldn't help but feel a pang of something unfamiliar in his chest. Pity? No, that wasn't quite right. It was a sense of recognition, perhaps, though he could not immediately place why. The wind picked up again, carrying with it a biting edge that made Baron's eyes water. He blinked and glanced away, breaking the spell of his observation. He hesitated, the faintest flicker of indecision crossing his usually composed features. He had no particular reason to linger here, no obligation to involve himself in the life of this stranger. And yet, he lingered. The man shifted slightly, drawing his coat tighter around his frail frame, and for a brief moment his eyes lifted. They locked with Baron's, a fleeting connection that felt heavier than the seconds it lasted. There was something in the man's gaze, defiance perhaps, or maybe resignation. It was impossible to say for certain, but it was enough to stir something within Baron. He felt as though the city itself had paused for that instant, the noise and motion dulled to a distant hum. Baron Trump was not a man prone to impulsive action. His life had been one of deliberate choices, every step calculated, every interaction weighed. And yet, as he stood there on the edge of the subway steps, he felt the faint stirrings of a decision forming, whether he would act on it or simply move on as the rest of the city had. But for now, he stayed, his presence a quiet counterpoint to the indifference that surrounded him. The car glided smoothly through the icy streets of New York City, its engine a low hum against the winter's relentless howl. Baron Trump sat in the back seat, his gloved fingers resting lightly on the edge of the leather armrest. The city rushed past in a blur of grays and whites, a landscape painted in the tones of winter's harsh indifference. Snowflakes clung stubbornly to the car windows before melting, their fleeting existence unnoticed by most. But Baron's sharp blue eyes caught every detail, his gaze flicking between the outside world and the city he had grown to know so well. They were approaching a familiar intersection near the subway entrance, a place he had passed countless times. But this time, something stopped him. It wasn't the chaos of the city or the cold, but a figure within, motionless and familiar. It was the man from the subway steps. The driver noticed the slight shift in Baron's posture, the way his head turned to follow the figure as they passed. "Sir, something the matter?" the driver asked, glancing briefly at him in the rearview mirror. "Stop the car," Baron said, his voice calm but firm. The driver hesitated. "Here, sir. It's not the best spot." "I said stop," Baron repeated, his tone brooking no argument. The car came to a halt along the curb, snow crunching softly beneath its tires. Baron adjusted the collar of his coat and stepped out, ignoring the biting wind that immediately cut through the warmth of the vehicle. His polished shoes met the salt-streaked sidewalk with quiet purpose as he approached the man who sat slumped on the subway steps, just as he had been earlier that day. Jacob, though Baron did not yet know his name, looked no different than he had before. His thin, tattered coat and frayed hat offered no real protection against the freezing temperatures. His hands, red and raw from the cold, trembled slightly as they gripped the edges of his coat. Baron stopped a few feet away, his presence unmistakable but his approach cautious, as if not to startle the man. "Good evening," Baron said, his voice measured but soft. Jacob looked up, his hollowed eyes narrowing slightly in suspicion. He said nothing, his body language wary, as if bracing for some insult or dismissal that had become a routine part of his life. Baron held up a hand, a gesture of peace. "I don't mean to bother you. I just thought you might appreciate this." He nodded toward the driver, who had stepped out of the car and was now approaching with a steaming cup of coffee in a paper sleeve. The scent of the coffee reached Jacob before the cup did, and his hands twitched involuntarily toward it. He hesitated, glancing up at Baron as though searching for the catch. When he found none, he reached out and took the cup, wrapping his frozen fingers around its warmth. For a moment, he said nothing, simply holding it as if the heat alone were enough to revive him. "Thank you," Jacob muttered finally, his voice rough and barely audible. Baron nodded, his expression unreadable. He reached into the pocket of his coat and withdrew a neatly folded billone that Jacob could clearly see was far more than the small bills most passers-by might throw his way. Baron extended it toward him. "And this, to help with whatever you might need." Jacob stared at the money, then at Baron, his face a mixture of disbelief and confusion. "Why?" he asked, the single word carrying the weight of years of hardship and unanswered prayers. Baron considered the question for a moment, his gaze steady. "Because I can," he said simply. "And because you shouldn't be out here in this cold." Jacob hesitated again, then reached out with trembling hands to take the money. The coffee in his other hand steamed gently, the warmth seeming to seep into his body as he gripped both gifts. I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," Baron replied. "Just take care of yourself." But even as he said it, he felt the hollowness of his own words. Take care of yourself. What did that even mean for a man like Jacob? Was it as simple as giving money and walking away, or was there more to be done? For the first time in a long while, Baron felt the faint stirrings of doubt in his otherwise orderly mind. Instead of leaving immediately, Baron lingered, studying Jacob's face. "What's your name?" he asked after a moment. "Jacob," the man said, his voice still hesitant but steadier now. "Well, Jacob, if you're willing, I'd like to know more about you. Everyone has a story, and I have a feeling yours is worth hearing." Baron gestured to the open car door, the warm interior glowing faintly against the stark backdrop of the city. "Let me give you a ride somewhere. A shelter, perhaps, or anywhere you'd prefer." Jacob's eyes widened slightly, as though the offer was too much to comprehend all at once. For a moment he said nothing, the weight of his pride battling with his desperation. Finally, he gave a small nod. "All right," he said quietly. Barron smiled faintly, a flicker of satisfaction crossing his usually composed features. "Good, come on then." Together, they walked toward the car, the snow crunching beneath their feet. It was a small gesture, perhaps. But as they drove off into the icy night, it felt like the beginning of something larger, a connection forged in the cold, against the odds, and with the faint hope that even in a city as vast and indifferent as New York, one act of compassion could still matter. The warm interior of the car was a stark contrast to the unforgiving chill outside. The quiet hum of the heater filled the space as Baron Trump sat across from Jacob, his sharp blue eyes fixed intently on the man before him. Jacob held the steaming cup of coffee Baron had given him earlier, his trembling hands wrapped tightly around it. The warmth seemed to anchor him, grounding him in a moment that felt almost surreal after the cold, harsh reality of the subway steps. For a while Jacob said nothing, the lines etched into his face deepening as he stared out the window. Baron didn't press him, letting the silence linger. He knew better than to rush someone like Jacob. Pain, like ice, had to thaw on its own. The city blurred past, its glowing lights muted by the frost-covered windows. And still, Baron waited. Finally, Jacob spoke. His voice was low and rough, like a man unaccustomed to being heard. "I wasn't always like this," he began, his eyes still fixed on the distant cityscape. "I had a life once, a family, a home." Baron leaned forward slightly, his interest piqued, but his expression composed. He asked gently. Jacob hesitated, his hands tightening around the coffee cup. "My wife, her name was Mariache, was everything to me. Smart, kind, the kind of person who could light up a room just by walking into it. We had a daughter, Emily. She was only 8. His voice cracked, and he paused to take a shuddering breath. That was enough. Baron remained silent, his gaze unwavering as Jacob continued. "It all happened so fast. One night, a fire broke out in our apartment building. Electrical wiring, they said. Faulty, cheap work by a landlord who didn't care. Maria and Emily, they didn't make it out." His voice broke completely now, and he fell silent, his shoulders shaking as he tried to compose himself. Baron's chest tightened. He'd heard stories of loss before, but there was something raw and immediate about Jacob's words that pierced through his usually guarded demeanor. "I'm sorry," Baron said quietly, the weight of the words settling heavily between them. Jacob nodded but didn't look up. "After that, I just fell apart. Lost my job, lost everything. You think you're strong enough to handle anything, but grief, it's like this tide that pulls you under, and no matter how hard you fight, you just can't breathe." Baron sat back, his hands clasped loosely in his lap as he considered Jacob's words. The man before him wasn't just a victim of misfortune. He was someone who had been utterly undone by forces beyond his control. And yet, he was still here, surviving against all odds, even if just barely. That, Baron thought, took a kind of strength not everyone. "What about your family? Friends? No one to help you?" Baron asked after Jacob let out a bitter laugh. "Family's gone. Friends disappeared when the bills started piling. People don't know what to say to someone who's lost everything. So, they just stop saying it." Baron nodded slowly, his mind already turning over possibilities. He wasn't a man given to impulsive decisions, but something about Jacob's story struck a chord in him. He'd seen the indifference of the world time and time again, the way it chewed people up and spit them out without a second thought. But this was different. He couldn't just walk away. "You're not going back to the streets," Baron said firmly, breaking the heavy silence that had settled between them. His tone left no room for Jacob blinked, startled. "I'm going to help you," Baron continued, his voice steady. "We'll get you somewhere warm tonight, and tomorrow we'll figure out." Jacob shook his head, his expression a mix of disbelief and skepticism. "Why would you do that? You don't even know." Baron met his gaze, without hesitation. "Because I can, and because no one should have to face what you've been through." Jacob stared at him for a long moment, the weight of his doubts clear in his eyes. I don't know if I can ever get back to who I was, he said quietly. Baron's expression softened, and for the first time, a faint smile touched his lips.
You don't have to do it alone.
That's the point. As the car pulled to a stop outside a modest but well-kept shelter, Baron pulled out his phone, his fingers moving quickly as he sent a series of messages. His team was efficient, and discreet qualities he had cultivated in his business dealings, and he knew they would rise to the task. I'll have my team reach out to you tomorrow, Baron said, slipping a business card into Jacob's hand. They'll help you get what you need, a place to stay, whatever it. Jacob looked down at the card, his fingers tracing the embossed lettering as though it might disappear if he didn't hold on to it tightly enough. I don't know how to thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You don't need to, Baron replied simply. Just promise me one. Jacob looked up, his expression questioned. Don't give up, Baron said. Not. For the first time in years, Jacob allowed himself a glimmer of hope. As Baron stepped back into the car and the door closed behind him, Jacob watched it drive away, the warmth of the coffee still in his hands, and the weight of the business card in his pocket. It wasn't a solution, not yet, but it was a start. And sometimes, a start was enough. The sharp wind whipped through the streets of New York City as Baron Trump once again found himself stepping out of his warm car and into the cold night. He had passed this particular alleyway before another thread, in the sprawling, frayed fabric of the city's forgotten lot. But something about this night, and the figure hunched beneath a ragged tarp, compelled him to stop. The man sitting there was older, his face lined with years of hardship and sorrow. A patchy gray beard framed his gaunt cheeks, and his tattered coat barely clung to his thin frame. He had the hollow-eyed look of someone who had seen too much, and carried the weight of it all with him. Every step, his shaking hands cradled a faded photograph, the edges worn from countless touches. He didn't notice Baron at first, too consumed by whatever memories the photos stirred. Good evening, Baron said, his deep voice carrying warmth despite the icy. The man looked up, startled. His eyes darted between Baron's tailored overcoat and the polished shoes standing before him. He clutched the photograph tighter, as though Baron might take it. Evening, the man replied gruffly, his voice rough from the cold and years. Baron crouched slightly, meeting the man at eye level. Do you have somewhere to go tonight? The man let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. This is it, he said, gesturing around the alleyway. Home sweet. Baron's expression softened, his mind already working to piece together the story behind this man's plight. What's your name? Michael, the man said after a long pause, as though the act of giving his name carried more weight than it should. Not that it matters. It does matter, Baron said firmly. To me, it matters. Tell me, Michael, how did you end up? Michael looked at him suspiciously, his eyes narrowing.
You care.
Why do you care? You one of those people who stop to make yourself feel better? Toss a 20 and move. His tone was laced with both anger and despair, the kind that comes from a lifetime of being ignored. Baron didn't flinch. He simply held Michael's gaze, his voice No, Michael, I'm not here for that. I've heard enough stories to know they matter, and I think yours matters too, so if you're willing, I'd like to listen. Something in Baron's calm sincerity seemed to disarm Michael. He glanced down at the photograph in his hands, his fingers trembling slightly as he smoothed its surface. After a long silence, he began to speak. I wasn't always like this, Michael said, echoing words Baron had heard before. I had a family, a wife, Anna, and a daughter, Emily. They were my whole. Anna, she was the kind of woman who made everything feel possible. And Emily, she was just like her mother. Smart, kind, always smiling. His voice faltered, and he swallowed. We didn't have much, but we had each other. Baron leaned forward slightly, listening intently. Then, Anna got sick, Michael continued, his voice growing quieter. Cancer. We sold everything to pay for her treatments, but it wasn't enough. She
Didn't make it.
He paused, his shoulders trembling under the weight of his. I couldn't hold it together after that. Lost my job, lost the apartment. And worst of all, Baron's breath caught. You lost? Michael nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Social services took her. Said I couldn't take care of her. They said it was for the best, but they didn't know she's all I had. She's in foster care now. I've been trying to find her, but he trailed off, gesturing helplessly to his surroundings.
What did I do from
For a moment, Baron was silent, the enormity of Michael's loss settling heavily in the space between them. His mind raced, but his voice remained calm. Do you know where she is? Anything about the family she's with? The icy winds of New York seemed to soften in the wake of Baron Trump's unprecedented gesture. Weeks after reuniting Michael and Emily through a carefully arranged video call, Baron sat in his office overlooking Manhattan. In front of him lay the framework for something Great planned to ensure no family would have to endure the separation and suffering that Michael and Emily had faced. For all his wealth and power, Baron had never considered himself an emotional man, but the experience of meeting Michael had stirred something deep within him, a sense of duty. $2 million, he said, his tone steady but purposeful as he addressed his chief of philanthropy. I wanted to go toward family reunifications, legal fees, housing support, counseling, whatever it. The declaration sent a ripple through his organization. The Trump Foundation, already well known for its philanthropic endeavors, shifted its focus almost overnight. Baron's donation of $2 million wasn't just a transaction, it was a call to act. The money would go toward creating programs to reunite families separated by circumstances beyond their control, be it poverty, bureaucratic barriers, or tragedies like the one Michael had endured. Within days, news of Baron's donation broke across media outlets, and the public response was overwhelming. Social media buzzed with praise, and stories of struggling families poured in, each one pleading for help. Baron, who had always avoided the limelight where his charitable acts were concerned, found himself at the center of attention. Yet, he handled it with quiet dignity, shifting the focus back to the cause. This isn't about me, Baron said during a rare television interview. It's about the families who've been torn apart, and the children who've been left behind. If my resources can help even a fraction of them, then it's a responsibility I'm proud to take. The gesture ignited a wave of kindness. Inspired by Baron's actions, other wealthy individuals and organizations stepped forward, donating their own time and money to the cause. Social workers volunteered to streamline the reunification process. Legal firms offered pro bono services, and shelters expanded their programs for struggling families. The ripple effect was undeniable. What began as one man's act of compassion was quickly becoming Emily and Michael's new beginning. For Michael and Emily, Baron's generosity marked the beginning of a new chapter. True to his word, Baron had mobilized his resources to secure Michael a stable future. A modest but comfortable home in Queens was purchased in Michael's name, furnished with everything Emily would need to feel safe and welcome. Michael, once a man consumed by despair, now had a steady job through one of Baron's business connections and entry-level role that gave him the dignity of earning an income while still allowing him time to focus on rebuilding his relationship with his daughter. The day Emily moved in was one of quiet celebration. Baron visited the small house personally, his presence understated, but he had arranged for a team to decorate Emily's room with warm, cheerful Tachessa soft pink comforter, shelves filled with books, and a small desk for her to do her homework. The walls were adorned with framed pictures of Emily and her parents from happier times, carefully restored from old photos Michael had kept hidden in his coat pocket for years. This is your home now, Baron told Emily, as she clutched a stuffed bear that had once been hers, rediscovered and returned to her. You'll never have to wonder where you belong. Emily's eyes shone with tears as she looked up at him.
Thank you, Mr. Trump.
She said softly. Baron smiled, kneeling to meet her gaze. Call me Baron, he said, and you don't need to thank me. Just promise me you'll make this house a place full of love and happiness. Michael, standing in the doorway, couldn't find the words to express his gratitude. His life had been transformed, not just by Baron's financial support but by the genuine care and respect the man had shown. For the first time in years, he felt like a father again. He could wake up each morning knowing he had the chance to give Emily the life she'd. The weeks turned into months, and Michael and Emily settled into their new normal. Emily returned to school, quickly making friends and excelling in her classes. Michael attended counseling sessions arranged by Baron's team, working through the grief and guilt that had weighed him down for so long. And though they still had moments of struggle, They faced them together, with a bond that grew stronger each. Baron, true to his word, remained a steady presence in their lives. He checked in regularly, ensuring they had everything they. On Emily's birthday, he sent her a carefully chosen gift, a telescope, knowing she had once dreamed of becoming an astronomer. It was a small gesture, but one that reflected his continued investment in their happiness. As the anniversary of Michael and Emily's reunion approached, Baron decided to mark the occasion with a gesture that would carry meaning far beyond material wealth. He commissioned a locket for Emily, a delicate silver piece, engraved with the word hope. Inside, one side held a tiny photo of her and her father, and the other side was left blank and empty space for a future memory yet to be made. At a quiet dinner with Michael and Emily, Baron presented the gift.
This is for you,
He said, handing the locket to her. A reminder that even in the darkest times, hope can carry us through. Emily opened the locket, her fingers tracing the engraving. It's beautiful, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It's more than just jewelry, Baron said, his tone gentle but It's a symbol for you, for your dad, and for everyone who hears your story. A reminder that kindness, real kindness, has the power to change lives. The story of Michael and Emily's journey, and Baron's role in it, spread far and wide. News outlets picked up the tale, sharing it alongside images of Emily wearing her locket and Michael standing proudly by her side. The story resonated deeply, inspiring people across the globe to take action in their own community. Donations to family reunification programs surged, and countless families found their way back to one another, thanks to the movement Baron had ignited. But for Baron, the real legacy wasn't in the headlines or the act. It was in the quiet moments, the look of hope in Michael's eyes, the smile on Emily's face, and the knowledge that his actions had given them a second chance. It was in the letters he received from strangers, each one sharing how the story had inspired them to reach out, to give back, to believe in the possibility of change. Years later, when Emily graduated from college, Baron was there, sitting quietly in the audience. She spotted him in the crowd and smiled, clutching the silver locket that still hung around her. It had been a constant companion through every challenge and triumph, a reminder of where she had come from and how far she had gone. Baron Trump's name would go down in history as a philanthropist, a businessman, and an advocate for family. But for Emily and Michael, his legacy was far simpler. He was the man who had given them back their lives and, in doing so, reminded the world of the extraordinary power of kindness.